Hello everyone, and welcome back to Brickhead Garage. On today's episode, we're doing something not air conditioning related. We're going to be covering the installation, and it's going to be a bit of a review of the COSMO Racing short shifter kit for a T5 Camaro or Firebird. So this is a slightly cheaper alternative to the common Pro 5.0, or common is a bit of a stretch, but the most popular short shifter that I can tell, at least these days. And I went for this one simply as a matter of price. Not only is the purchase price cheaper, but the big factor for me was I was able to find a local supplier in Canada which made shipping much cheaper. Shipping from the US to Canada right now is a bit of a gong show. So I haven't seen many reviews of this. I saw, I believe, one person who shared their experience on the 3rd Gen forum. However, other than that, it seems to be pretty unknown. Now, they do seem to be a relatively common supplier of short shifters for import cars, but like I said, I couldn't find many reviews on the Camaro forum, so I thought I would try it out and share my opinions. So, right off the bat, it feels really solidly built. It's got a big, solid, I'd imagine this is steel handle, chrome finished. It's got a big, heavy steel base. We'll have to see the difference in length down here, because that is what actually makes a short shifter. So we'll take out the stock shifter and we'll compare. Okay, that's not quite right. The difference in a short shifter isn't that the length underneath the mounting plate is longer. Actually, it has to be the exact same length. The difference is the pivot point of the shifter is shifted upwards, so that the shorter throw can still facilitate a movement of the same distance within the transmission. But overall build quality is seeming great. There are a slight couple imperfections in the steel here. Nothing that I'm concerned about, but just something worth noting. There's another one here. Again, the steel's so thick that I'm not concerned about that in the slightest. So the kit comes with the shifter itself, it's a hard kind of metal sticker, it says COSMO Racing, as well as a new set of bolts and washers. I'd imagine the thickness of this plate is probably different, and the bolts are probably to account for that. Although, again, we will compare with the stock bolts when we take them out. So, included is the instructions. They seem pretty straightforward. And I also picked up a new shifter bushing. So this will go essentially in the transmission, and it's what this ball sits in. So, chances are the one in your car is potentially okay, but I figured, these cars are 30 years old. It's a cheap part. We're going in there anyway. We might as well replace it. So the first step that we're going to go to now is we're going to have to remove the center console just to get at the shifter. So we'll go do that now. After getting the center console out of the way, we can finally reach the screws holding the lower shift boot in place. The lower shift boot can now be slowly slid off of the shifter, revealing the shifter mounting bolts. Before we remove the shifter, however, we're going to want to clean the area and try and minimize the amount of crud we drop into the transmission. A little bit of a wipe down with the paper towels should help remove any loose debris. Now that it's cleaned up, it's time to bust loose the bolts and remove the shifter. A long extension helps a lot with this, as the shifter is quite bulky in the bottom and interferes with the ratchet. Finally, with the bolts out, a screwdriver helps us pry up and break the RTV seal. Then the shifter comes right off. To remove the old shifter bushing, we can use the same flathead screwdriver as before and gently pry it out of the transmission. Okay, so here's our old shifter. Other than being dirtier, you can tell it's a little different in design to our new one. I match them up like that. So the old one's got a rubber boot at the bottom. The new one uses a different design. Not entirely sure what's going on. And you can see the old one just uses a stamped steel base, whereas the new one's a very thick flange. So that's probably what our new bolts are for. They're longer to account for this extra thickness. The old one has this big section down here which sealed against the rubber boot that covered the floor. This one, I don't think it's going to seal as well, so maybe we'll use some electrical tape or something to try and build up the diameter down here so that it'll seal. The other thing to note is that, well, quite literally, the new shifter is shorter, as you can see here. But also, if I line these up, this way. If I line these up where the base would contact, it looks like this one is just a tad bit longer. But it's also hard to tell where the actual pivot point is vertically, because that's really what matters. In this one, it's much likely that it's higher, which I believe would account for the shorter stroke. So, the old bushing looked to be in decent shape. We're going to be replacing it anyways because, like I said, we're in here, we might as well. But yeah, now that we've got the two compared, it's time to go back to the car and reinstall everything. Before we can install the new shifter, we need to remove the traces of RTV left from the old shifter. Because the shifter hole goes straight into the transmission, it's very important that we plug the hole with some paper towels or something similar to keep debris from falling in as we scrape away the RTV with a razor blade. With the paper towels removed, we can gently slip the new shifter bushing into place. The instructions for the shifter called for lithium grease inside the shifter bushing. I was unsure as to what the grease I had on hand was made from, and in a lapse of judgment decided to use white lithium grease in the bushing. Although I don't think it's the end of the world, if you're going to do this yourself, go out and purchase some proper lithium grease meant for this kind of application. The next step is to add a thin layer of RTV to help seal the new shifter to the transmission. You don't want it too thick, as that's just going to make a mess. Just take your time and add a small bead all the way around the shifter mounting flange. Next, we can drop the new shifter into place. It's best practice to try and get it as aligned as possible when installing it, so you don't displace the RTV. However, because the shifter itself needs to seat into the bushing, this can be a little difficult. I ended up needing to do a little bit of wiggling to get the bolt holes aligned, but try and do your best to keep this to a minimum. With the bolts installed finger tight, we used a socket and an extension to snug them down by hand, before torquing them to the recommended spec, per COSMO Racing, of 8 to 10 foot-pounds. You might notice that one of the bolts is different in this shot, and that's because I had some issues with stripped threads and had to do some repair. It's unlikely this was an issue with the supplied bolts, as the bolt had no apparent damage on it, and I tried swapping it into a different hole with no issues. With the rubber boot back in place, we can clearly see the issue with the smaller diameter shift handle. I did some digging through the garage, and managed to find an old valve cover bushing from the 396 in my dad's 1968 Impala, that seemed to match the inner and outer diameters I was looking for. I slid the bushing down the shifter and snugged the boot into place over top of it. I later added some tape to help keep the boot from falling off, and while it's far from perfect, it at least makes me feel better about the whole thing. Saving you the boredom of watching me reinstall the console, the next step will be to install this rubber piece that keeps the upper shift boot in place. Then we can put the upper shift boot plate back in, and reinstall the shift knob, and that's it! Installation is complete. So what do I think? First of all, the biggest difference in the feel of this shifter is how mechanical it feels. There's no longer any kind of rubber bushing to dampen your shifts. They feel raw, firm, and a little bit more precise. It's really hard to describe the difference, but I think just the sound that the shifter makes will give a good impression. That's the other big difference, sound. Because the shifter does not seal very well against the boot, there's gonna be more road noises entering the cabin, especially if there wasn't a rubber grommet in place like I put on. Additionally, because the shifter is now purely metal with no rubber to isolate vibrations, you can actually hear the gears of the transmission spinning through the shifter. I personally think it's a pretty cool noise, but some would disagree, and unfortunately it's a hard noise to record. But if you do this mod and start hearing weird noises, it could very likely just be that. All in all, the overall throw of the shifter from first to second was decreased by a little bit more than an inch, but I really don't think that's the best part of this shifter. For me, it's the strong mechanical feel of the shifts. They feel very firm and more precise, along with being shorter. Overall, I'm happy with the shifter, but I'm not sure it's for everyone. If it's in your price range and you like to tinker with your car, and you aren't afraid of a few extra noises, I think the pros outweigh the cons, but I wouldn't say it's a must-have item. Thank you so much for making it to the end of the video. If you enjoyed it, please drop a like and consider subscribing. It really means a lot.